Kia ora tātou, it's great to see you all. I thought I might be pitted against extremely exotic and fashionable overseas celebrities, so I'm pleased to see so many. People have turned up to see a local girl. It's cool. I also just have to say I flew in very early from Wellington, where we were showing Hey Toki Puna Festival, and Wellington is very grumpy with the Big Screen Symposium because diminished their box office down there, and it gave me a very early morning. But I want to start by saying there are not many positive aspects to growing older. One is you can get a sense of perspective, both of the world and politics and your own life. And I read somewhere, and I can't remember who said it, one has to face aging with an equal combination of resistance and grace. And I always thought that was rather a nice attitude, in fact. Now, I have a relatively long list of works. It surprises me when I look at them, in fact, and there's something a little unnerving about going back over one's history, and that's what I'm going to do today. Because I've got a lot of time to fill, and I thought maybe a biographical approach would be most useful. But for reasons that are not just about me and biography, to try and think about shifts in the context within which we all have worked, I think is an important thing to do. Probably as much in drama, but particularly in documentary, and I will try and elaborate on that a little. Most of my works I've made since 1993, which is when I came back from a long stint in the United States. So I came back to take up a position at the University of Auckland and sort of hopefully carry on with what I was doing. So I'm going to try and situate my work in its changing context as I suggested. And what I'm going to do for the sake of hopefully elegance and timeliness is show three works that were made roughly a decade apart. So that does certainly age me. But the first is called Counter-Terror. It was a series that I made while I was still in the United States. Then Punitive Damage, a film that was released in 1999, 2000. The most recent work, Hey Toki Puna, which by the way means the hidden ads. It's based on a Māori proverb, and the meaning is sort of the hidden ads cuts deeper, store the hidden intention is the most damaging, effectively, or the most hurtful. I was actually preparing a class last week, and it was a documentary history paper, in fact, and we were looking at two early films, actually kind of made before the word documentary was really invented. It was Man with a Movie Camera and The Look of the North, as well as a very fine film called Spanish Earth. And I was reading a chap called Thomas Moore, who's given that to the students, and he said this thing which I quite liked. The documentary has often been the first recourse of the radical artist, the first recourse of the radical artist. And I wanted to take up that quote, actually, because in some ways radical suggests, of course, political activism or engagement. An artist suggests formal innovation. And very often these sorts of things are seen as contradictory. You know, one cannot be sort of political and didactic while also being formally innovative. But I do feel that that is what documentary can and has offered, and there is a tradition of that, really stemming probably from Man with a Movie Camera and The Look of the North. These films that were so early they weren't even called documentary at that point, but did definitely deal with what we call the discourse of the real, you know, fragmented, constructed documentary, if you like, out of fragments of reality, not of fictional elements. But to suggest that documentary makers are artists sometimes is antithetical to notions of documentary as truth. You know, often people see documentary as a mere window on the world. And in fact, as any practitioner or critical reader understands, there's a lot of manipulation that goes, I don't like to call it, that's got a sort of negative connotation, but you know, you choose a subject, you choose people to be in it, you frame people, you like them, you add music, you cut them in certain ways. So by the time you come up with a film in the end, it's very much a kind of reconstruction or a representation of the world. Never can it just be a window. I mean, maybe you can say, well, you know, if you're in a supermarket and there's a surveillance camera up in the corner, maybe that's the window on the world. But even that has its own aesthetic look and it's kind of grainy. So I guess just to go back, the first recourse this notion of the radical artist, which is something that I guess I also relate to because it kind of gels also with my own personal history. I can see why documentary now is the pathway I ended up on. esteem to call me a mentor, but in fact I often say to people that I kind of just made it up as I went along, or perhaps I sort of chose opportunities or seized opportunities as they arose. I never really had a grand plan. So I'm always a little reluctant to give my students a grand plan because that's kind of not how I work. I think it explains the kind of approaches to my work. I did a mediocre science degree because I was a girl that could do sciences, apparently. In those days, that's what you were pushed into. But I was never particularly keen on science. So I ended up doing a postgraduate diploma in journalism for 4 years for Radio New Zealand. And the good thing, I worked in the end for Morning Report and Checkpoint, so I learned a lot about the world, which began to really engage and interest me. The bad thing was that I really feared becoming a civil servant. There was this sort of tea trolley coming in the morning and afternoon tea, and I could imagine a dreary life unfolding. So I decided to move to New York, which seemed at the time far more exciting than Radio New Zealand. And it was pretty thrilling, I have to say. Now I am going to go back to concepts of documentary, but in New York I began to pursue the life. We called ourselves independent producers. We didn't call ourselves documentary filmmakers. We called ourselves independent producers and sometimes video artists. Because at this point in the 1980s, and this is perhaps to reference back to a context, documentary had an association with television. Television with deep suspicion. Its commercial underpinnings, its corporate control, its political and formal conservatism was something that we eschewed, and as I'm talking about, we being this sort of community of independent producers. So we actually favoured distributing and showing films to each other, and this tended to be in sort of galleries and art spaces, community media organisations, etc. And you know, one of the good things and maybe negative things about New York, it's big enough to have these large communities. You know, it becomes viable. You have an audience. So that's kind of how we operated. And the other interesting thing is that portable video had just become available. I mean, it's hard to remember now the ubiquity of, you know, phones and recording devices, etc. But television video only just become available really to artists and to people in the kind of cultural communities. And it tended to be two groups who took up this exciting new toy. One was visual artists, conceptual artists, so there were people like Korea and Namjoon Pai, who did something called TV Buddha. So formal artists who used it more in a gallery context. And then of course communities like advocacy groups, minority groups, political movements that wanted to use this new tool as a way of exploring what they considered an underrepresented experience that they had. So these two arms, if you like, the kind of visual conceptual artists and the communities kind of fused. And a lot of us in the end started to weave those two elements into a kind of practice that we call independent production. And of course, these were the Reagan years, so these were tough contested years. There was a lot to argue with. You know, for the so-called radical artists, there was a lot to argue with, from military intervention in Latin America due to homophobia and ignoring the plight of those with HIV and AIDS. There was general racism and punitive policies towards minorities and the poor. So it was really quite an exciting time to be in New York. It was a negative time to be in the US in a way, but there was a lot of action and a lot of activity, and that inevitably involved using these tools in production, you know, for both formal innovation, as I suggest, but also radical expression. So I want to begin by showing a couple of excerpts, or maybe just one, depending on the time, from a major series that I did in the US. This was the major work that I did before I came back to New Zealand. The series we call Counter-Terror, and I made it with my then partner, Chris Bratton, personal and business partner. So it is rather strange going through this trip through memory lane with its length, I have to say. This was intended, we shot this in the 1980s, late 1980s, we sort of finished it in the early 90s, and it has an interesting resonance today, and actually some close relationship to the book that I just finished, I realised, as I prepared this paper. It was intended as a 4-part series that took us at its base really what we call the discourse of terrorism. You might go on to the discourse of terrorism, we argued, was constructed by a sort of triumvirate of sort of politicians, the Reagan administration or maybe Margaret Thatcher, right-wing academics, like often branded as terrorism experts, in the media. And we argued that this concept of the terrorist had actually supplanted that of the communist. That really anti-communism had been the sort of most pronounced discourse, if you like, about dealing with any kind of dissent, be it internal or external. We started to argue as we watched what was happening that terrorism was starting to supplant the Cold War rhetoric of anti-communism. So what we decided to do, and we argued that, in particular, the term was used to criminalise dissent. So anyone who was dissenting, it was very easy to call them a terrorist and to dismiss them or to make people fearful of them. It was used to obfuscate history. So rather than looking perhaps at the context that produced armed struggle or produced dissent, it just made them into evil, and so you didn't really have to look at contexts. And interestingly, in some ways then, in this pre-9/11 culture, and this was a good 10 years before 2001, the series did really anticipate the endless war on terror that we now seem to be subject to. We made particular focus on the media and how it tended to reproduce the ideological positions of the government, and often did sensationalise armed struggle or terrorism without ever giving a context for it. So our plan, this is our plan, was to produce 4 discrete segments that could sort of be shown together and show how these very different circumstances, the same dynamics of criminalising dissent was happening. So believe it or not, I'm amazed I survived this actually when I was writing this. The 4 communities that we explored, or countries, were remnants of the black militant movements in the United States. Some of you will have heard of the Black Panther Party. That was a movement of self-determination in the 1960s. By the time we were making this in the sort of late 80s, it had largely, they were mostly imprisoned or dead or very much diminished as a political force. We worked with north of Ireland, so Sinn Féin is the political party, but closely affiliated with the IRA. We worked in Lebanon and with the Puerto Rican independentistas. Puerto Rico had a movement for independence, and that movement saw Puerto Rico as a colony of the US. Excuse me. So this was a pretty exciting project, as you can imagine. What we also wanted to do, though, was to try and collaborate with existing filmmakers or filmmaking groups within those communities, because this was also a time of what one would call now identity politics, where groups very much wanted to represent their own experience. So it wasn't so cool for 2 educated middle class to do the story of someone else's experience. So we decided we'd go to try and collaborate with filmmakers or groups within those communities. They were variably successful. 2 of them, Framing the Panthers in Black and White and Counter-Terror North of Ireland, did very well at festivals, accrued quite a lot of awards, and even edged their way onto television. The other 2 were more difficult. The Hezbollah piece ended up made by 2 people who are quite well-known artists now. It was quite formally difficult, and so it didn't get so much of an audience. And the Puerto Rican one, I have to say, was a bit patched together. We only ever showed them as we intended, all together once at the Museum of Modern Art, in fact. And our intentions, I think, were good, and that was quite an interesting screening, because a lot of police came, because a lot of the police are Irish and have Republican sympathies. And a lot of African Americans came because they wanted to watch the Black Panthers. And actually those 2 groups were very much, Irish cops and African Americans were kind of at war in the 80s too. So it was kind of an interesting experience, especially in kind of the sanctified halls of the Museum of Modern Art. So I'm going to show a longish clip of Framing the Panthers, which follows the story of a chap called Daruba Benoit Hart, who was a minor Black Panther Party leader from New York, who was imprisoned for 19 years for the apparent attempted murder of 2 police officers. His biography was pretty familiar. He was in trouble with the law in his teens. He converted to Islam in prison and became politicized, and then joined the movement for Black Liberation when he was released. He was immediately placed on an FBI surveillance list and subjected to a dirty tricks campaign at the time, which was called COINTELPRO, which is very much like the kind of counter-terrorism that we see today, or the war on terror. So I'm going to show this chunk, and I guess I will turn to this sort of idea of content and form after we have a look at it. And I'm happy to talk about it later too, with the question and answer session. But now this starts silent, so don't worry about this. Okay, so that's just a clip of Framing the Panthers. As I say, it's got echoes with today, surveillance, manipulation, all those sorts of issues that I think are very much in debate at the moment. Our intention here, I mean, when I look at it now, it's a relatively straightforward documentary, but we have these intersections of these students, and part of our intention was to show how history is not passed down. We found a lot of young African Americans at the time just didn't know about the Black Panther Party, and how these traditions were sort of prevented from being passed down, if you like. So in the end, actually, much to our luck, Durrell was released. His hard-working lawyers finally managed to show that he'd been framed, and he was released from prison. So that led to quite an exciting conclusion in the film. So that's just an example from the counter-terror series I wanted to show you. As I say, that was probably the film out of the four that did the best in terms of critical reception and some commercial reception as well. I have to say, Chris and I at that point did all the technical stuff too, so we did camera and sound and producing and directing, and so it was very much a kind of auteur-driven environment in that way in terms of filmmaking. So anyway, I'm going to skip on now. So this is sort of work from 1990, 1991. I'm going to skip on 10 years. And of course, by that stage, I was back in New Zealand. And while in the US, as well as teaching myself production, and I did very much learn on the streets because there was so much going on, I did continue with academic study. And I completed an MA in film studies at New York University. And that film studies was quite new then still. And luckily I fell into teaching, and one has to find a way to support oneself when one does this work. And of course that's the case for all of us still today. But I began teaching, and I was lucky in that I got a job at Brown University, which is a very prestigious Ivy League university. I was having the story in one class, I had Dinah Ross's twins, I had Ringo Starr's girlfriend's daughter, and I had Rory Kennedy, who herself now is a very well-known documentary maker, and who was Bobby Kennedy's daughter. I think she was in the room when he was shot. So those, it was kind of known as the sexy Ivy League, where film stars and musicians and politicians and their children. But I did, I found I always missed New Zealand, and when a job came up at Auckland University, I did apply and I got the position, and in a sense have kept up that career which began in the States of both making my own work and teaching to support myself. And I have found that Auckland University, although a little resistant initially to the idea that films could be proper academic research, I think thanks to the interest of students, they're much more receptive now. So, the university has obviously been supportive and good to me, and my work has been recognised, and that's helped me in my career too. When I came back, I made two further works, Wake, which was a very personal experimental work, and Seeing Red, a film about a filmmaker in New Zealand's National Film Unit in the 1940s, who had been a communist and was actually fired for his activism for being a communist. So those sorts of stories are still obviously resonating with me. But the context was very different. I mean, it was quite a shell shock to come back to New Zealand, more ways than one. Of course, I've been away for over a decade. It had a smaller, very conservative film culture, and there was very little activity that could be classified as alternative or avant-garde. And I think the advantage was its relatively small population and lack of a funding infrastructure meant one had to engage with a broader mainstream audience. And that's probably what I wanted to do anyway. I mean, I got a bit tired in New York of, showing our films to each other, as I say. And so having to engage with a broader mainstream audience does have its challenges as well. And it, in a sense, that did suit me. I mean, I'd become tired of the limitations of addressing smaller groups of fellow travellers, really. But also the culture of independent production had changed in New York too. The more political 80s had shifted to a more consumerist 1990s. Many of the political movements I mentioned earlier, feminism, African American rights, etc., tended to fragment more and become more engaged, I think, in almost like a sort of lifestyle politics, politics on the street. Although undoubtedly the gap between rich and poor had widened dramatically. And although in New York, Berlin and London there still was an avant-garde, many independent producers now define themselves more as documentary makers and were seeking niches on television. And many like me had started teaching or entered the industry in a more professionalised capacity. So the kind of radicalism within which I sort of started making work had shifted with the times too. In New Zealand, in fact, at this time, there was just heaps of television documentary, and some of you will remember that. There were 2 weekly series curated into Documentary New Zealand and Inside New Zealand that were commissioned by the broadcasters and funded by New Zealand On Air. And they appeared every week, and this kind of lively scene was boosted by an investment in the independent sector by New Zealand On Air. My understanding, and this is just to kind of speak about industrial context a little bit, because of all of the neoliberal restructuring that went on in the 1980s, TVNZ, our publicly owned broadcaster, was turned into a state-owned enterprise, was forced to generate a profit. And in a sense, New Zealand On Air, I think, was created as kind of a ring-fenced fund that would give a little local, would protect local content and hopefully keep up a bit of a public service mandate. But rather than being in a channel, so to speak, works would be potted across all the channels depending where the license fee came from. But at that point, there was a lot of documentary. It rated well, but the public service remit, I think, was weakened. But still, it was an important aspect of New Zealand On Air's remit, and audiences seemed to like it. A lot of it was cheap and cheerful, I have to say, but it did engage with a range of issues. And yes, as I say, New Zealanders were whale watchers. So in that context, I produced the film a decade on from Counter-Terror, Punitive Damage, which I produced with Galen Preston, I directed myself. And the film follows Helen Todd, who's a New Zealand woman whose gorgeous adult son, who was half Pakeha, half Malaysian, was shot and killed by the Indonesian military in East Timor in 1991 while that country remained under occupation. My understanding that this again was all fallout from the Cold War, that the US had feared an independent East Timor would become a kind of socialist presence in the region, and they were still angry and upset over the Vietnam loss. And so they were quite happy to look the other way or actively support the occupation of East Timor by Indonesia, which was a brutal occupation. About a third of the population was killed under its regime. So, and including, I've been aware of East Timor. The Dili massacre happened in 1991 when I still lived in New York, and I'd seen images, and the images actually reminded me of Latin America. I'd been surprised to find out this was happening in what I considered, New Zealand's backyard. The images, heavily Catholic country, graffiti on the wall, political graffiti, horrible stories of torture. A lot of it reminded me of Latin America, where I'd spent quite a lot of time while I lived in the States. So I was drawn, but I didn't know at that point a New Zealander had been killed. And the trigger for the film was hearing a short radio interview with Helen. She brought a lawsuit out against an Indonesian general through a whole set of circumstances. And I had just heard a little clip of her on something like Morning Report, and she struck me as having such grace and such insight that I just thought she would be, fabulous talent. And we're talking about a middle-aged Pakeha woman, not usually someone who usually would be up as brilliant talent, but she was extraordinary. So Punitive Damage did receive a license fee from TVNZ, but it ended up being a feature. As Galen's presence gave the Film Commission reassurance to deliver something. So, it got both broadcast and film financing, and it was quite successful. It won lots of awards, and it did open theatrically in 3 or 4 countries, and sold to major broadcasters like HBO and Channel 4. One of the dilemmas I feel in the film, there is still this sort of radical artist thing going on, and one of the problems of the film was that the court case was all well done and dusted before I started to make the film, and yet I understood that court proceedings in documentary or drama always, add dramatic potential to films wherever they're included. So I decided to try and recreate the actual trial, but I didn't want to find kind of characters that looked like my main characters. So what we did is we got the 3 witnesses and the 2 lawyers who were originally in the original lawsuit and got them together. And effectively, I sort of thought, well, in a way, if the lawyers ask the questions and the witnesses respond, we're going to kind of recreate the lawsuit pretty much. It doesn't have to be verbatim. They're not actors, they can't learn the lines, but they can respond honestly still. So that's what we did. We got the transcriptions of the original questions, the lawyers asked the questions, and the people and the 3 witnesses, one of whom was Helen, responded. But rather than trying to make it look like the real thing, we shot it in just a black backdrop. So it was quite simple. We did go to the actual courtroom and took black and white stills that gave it a kind of feeling of authenticity. But the actual performance of the trial, we didn't want to try and make it a kind of real reenactment. So I'll just show you the opening of this. So that's just the introduction to the film. Sorry, the audio is really quiet. I'm getting it louder. But as you can see, Helen brought this case out not just because of her own loss, but for the loss of the Timor's people. And as Christine said, I mean, in a way, this film inaugurated doing a series of films about sort of politics, but through a kind of personal lens. And they became known as sort of my human rights documentaries. I'll talk about that a little later. I mean, as you can see, we recreated a court case. I might show you another clip from that. Basically, what happened is after Kamal was killed, Helen went into grieving, of course, for a long time, but finally she went back to work, and she worked in microcredit. So she was based in Bangladesh, in a very, very remote village. And while she was in this village, unbeknownst to her, this group of very smart lawyers had figured out it was a combination. One of the generals that was held responsible for the massacre was actually sent to Harvard Business School to get him out of the limelight because the massacre had been filmed and was attention brought to the Indonesian actions. So because he was at Harvard, because Kamal was non-American, they could invoke a kind of piracy law. So these very clever lawyers really produced a case, and Helen found out while she was in Bangladesh. So I'll just play this little bit too. And this gives us a bit of humour too in this film, I think. So Helen was extraordinary to work with. I get quite choked up even watching it now. That's Kamal sitting with some people in the shoulder before he was killed. This film, of course, given it got New Zealand linear investment and film commission investment, was a much higher budget and much higher production value. So I really lost that sort of early thing that I've had of doing everything myself, although I still, to this day, tend to do a lot of editing, because I do think documentary is just, I mean, the editing process is so important in terms of the writing of the work. So I guess if we move on to the next slide, just operating this because it's a PC, let's get money with PCs. Since punitive damage, I have gone on and done actually a lot more work when I look at it. I just list them there because I'm going to skip over another 10 years. But just to say, many of the themes I grappled with in my earlier works continued throughout all of these works. With Georgie Girl, Sheila's in an Island Calling, I was addressing sexuality and gender, human rights issues in the Asia-Pacific region with not just punitive damage, but Pacific solution, an Island Calling and Brother Number One, sort of addressing, I guess, the futility of war in a lot of the works, Elgar's Enigma, but also punitive damage, Pacific solution, Brother Number One, and my newest work, Heto Kikuna. In fact, 3 of the works are quite similar. As I suggested earlier, punitive damage, an Island Calling, and Brother Number One all deal with family loss in unanticipated and brutal ways, usually in a situation of political conflict. And sometimes these are seen as a sort of trilogy of human rights documentaries. And just as a bit of an aside, I think this concept even of human rights is quite interesting. That's sort of arisen without us really sort of analysing it particularly, but it seemed to emerge out once the left, I think, was discredited for various reasons. Human rights seemed to stand in for what was a kind of progressive politic. The problem with human rights as a label, of course, is no one says they're against human rights. I mean, even George Bush wouldn't say he was against human rights. So it's got a rather elastic definition that means it could be applied to almost anything. But certainly those three works are seen as a trilogy of human rights documentary that specifically addressed the Asia-Pacific region. When I came back to New Zealand, I figured this is where we were and this is where I would like to work. So it's been very much my focus. We might go on to the next slide now. I'm now going to just talk about the most recent film that I co-produced and co-directed with Kay Almas, who, lucky thing, is still in Wellington today, having partied last night. I was in Wellington at the film festival showing this film, but she's managed to stay on, and I did my homework and came back here. This film, Hei Toki Huna, explores our role in Afghanistan, why we went, what we did there, and why we did so little about it. So quite a sort of simple concept, really, a simple brief. Interestingly though, I find it very much like the counter-terror series when I was preparing for this paper. It made me think about how similar the bookends of this talk would be in terms of the concepts I was looking at in both that early series and this film today. Whereas counter-terror was pre-9/11, it still engaged with concepts of counter-terrorism, which really, when I look at it, is effectively an early variant of the war on terror. Hei Toki Huna is definitely post-9/11, and its inception actually was the moment that we committed troops to fight in Afghanistan. But both engage a lot with media, whereas the counter-terror series was very much looking at how the discourse of terrorism was perpetuated by the mainstream media. I mean, I think now what we see is we've heard almost nothing about Afghanistan. You know, everything we've heard about through our mainstream media has pretty much been controlled by the government and the defence forces. So my motivation for making this work was to try and open up the debate, you know, to explore, as I say, why we went, what we did there, and why we heard so little about it. So strong similarities, which I thought was convenient giving us this talk today, but it struck me as an interesting fact too. This is probably my most overtly political work for a while. I mean, in a sense, my human rights documentaries tended to be more about after the fact, the lessons from history, the Cold War, etc. Whereas this one, I think, has certainly got us into some lively debates with people like Dr. Jonathan Coleman, who said it was a slur on the SAS. And we immediately said, well, you can't have seen it unless you've hacked into our Vimeo account. And we offered him a ticket, which he turned down. So I might show you the introduction of this, which we also use as our promo. What the film does is it uses our one journalist, John Stevenson, who's been going to Afghanistan since 2001. In fact, he got there shortly before our troops did, and has been going there consistently and has reported on New Zealand involvement there. He is very much disliked by the government, and recently he sued the Defence Force for defamation because they said he made stuff up. And one thing John does not do, he's not always the easiest person to work with, but he doesn't make stuff up. I mean, he's spent 11, 12 years in Afghanistan living on the smell of an oily rag, and the thing he believes in is journalistic integrity. I mean, in a way, he's quite old-fashioned. In that way, he believes in the fourth estate, that what journalists need to do is hold the powerful to account. So to suggest he made stuff up was so offensive to him that he felt he had to sue Rhys Jones, which he did. You may have followed that in the news, and it ended up being a hung jury. But John's just announced, using all of our footage as a backdrop on TV3, that he's going to relitigate, which you can do if it's a hung jury. So I guess it's a watch this space. But here's just the intro of Hei Toki Huna, because I think it does talk about the ideas at the core. Why are we there? If we're sending our young people to kill or to die, surely we need to know about it, and surely the government only has the right to Although I do have to say it's good to live in a country where you can protect the military. In many of the countries I've worked in, gone in 2 minutes. So, but I think those are responsibilities of democracies, and we can function as some sort of moral compass to countries that don't have that privilege. But as I said, I feel it's very much too about media representation. And I have to say John was not particularly well supported by journalists, because so many of them had been prepared to be embedded and ready to go over with John Key and film people doing war games and really be controlled. And as John himself says, there's nothing wrong with the perspectives of the military being told, but that surely is not the role of the journalist. The journalist is to find other stories and, God forbid, ask Afghans themselves what they think about our attempts to reconstruct their provinces or to bring so-called democracy to their country. So, but the issue around media representation is very similar, I think, to some of the questions we exercised 2 decades ago in counter-terror. So I wanted to just show you another section about the media, effectively. This is about halfway through the film. Just a little clip showing John on the ground and actually hearing from the Afghan voices, and you really realise what struck me when I first started logging this material is how it differs from the mainstream media that we have seen over decades. So just to make a few final comments, I've tried to locate these kind of decade-long gaps and located them within the different media landscapes that I like. So whereas the counter-terror series was done in kind of an exciting though terrible moment in US culture, punitive damage was when documentary seemed to be flourishing on broadcast television. And of course today the media scape has changed again. National broadcast television in most countries is suffering. The decline in advertising revenue, the impact of online media, the rise of satellite has impacted on, certainly on the kind of public broadcaster that supports documentary. The flourishing of one-off broadcast documentary is no more, and it's replaced obviously by popular factual series, reality and talent shows. Those are relatively cheap to produce, they rate well and have a regularity in the schedule that allows a kind of what is said to be a waning television audience to know when to book time to watch television. Our short-lived experiment with promising public broadcast channels TVNZ 6 and 7, although they were never big on broadcasting real documentaries, I have to say, but that's over. And it's increasingly difficult to get one-off creative documentaries or the documentaries proper funded, although Māori television and TV3 still are trying. They're running weekly series. What documentary is again subject to debate, particularly around controversial series like the GC. So really, I mean, in some ways I feel fortunate. At my point in my career, I've been able to have always been in production of series that lunge from project to project. I don't think it's ever been easy, but I think it's very important to think about the context within which we all work, to take opportunities when they arise. And so I'll probably just finish there. I was going to talk a bit about documentary on the big screen. Just briefly, what strikes me is there's a sort of documentary impulse that exists in every culture. And although documentary proper seems to have been squeezed out of television, it seems to have reappeared on the tiny screen and the great big screen. So you're seeing really great documentaries that were just in the festival this year, like Westfield Secrets about Assange, Dirty Wars, which is about the war on terror, films like The Inside Job, which gave an analysis of the financial meltdown. I mean, works that I feel should be actually in our lounge rooms have ended up on the big screen. So it's interesting that in some ways that recourse, I suppose, of the radical artist does find expression somewhere in the culture, even though it might be a struggle to do that. So I'll just finish there, and I'll be happy to take a few questions, and I hope I've made some sense. Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to ask whether you think the future of documentary is heading, because I think it is interesting that there's been such a shift in what you get on television now, and I still think there's a huge market out there for documentary. You can see that when you turn up at the film festival when everything's packed up. But I mean, do you think that's going to stay like this? What do you think is going to happen to the landscape?
Well, I think, and actually, there's probably a couple of people who are more expert than me, Anna Jackson and James Franklin at the back there. I mean, James is a web designer, and we're just about to stream Hey Toki through its website. and Anna is doing a PhD here at Auckland University on, she calls the ecology of documentary. So I think it's, you know, even looking at my longish career, it's a bit hard to predict. But as you say, I think there's always an appetite, and to me, if there is an appetite, the work will find its way of being seen, although we have a lot of impediments here, you know, slow broadband, you know, cap data, etc. So in some countries, I think it's much easier to see the sorts of works and even to find an economic foundation for that. So, I mean, there's certainly a development of the niche audience, etc., which to me is a bit of a problem, because I think it's still important to have, you know, a broad-based debate. But I mean, I'm sure those guys will probably. Do you want to add to that?
Do you want to go first?
I guess, you know, the very first interview I did for my thesis, somebody said to me, documentary will out. And I think that's true. I think it's just with the dispersal of documentary across different platforms and into other genres. I mean, everything just about is sort of infused with documentary in so many ways. I mean, documentary will always find a way, but I agree with you that the challenge to address now is with public service media and so much of documentaries increasingly being put behind a paywall. So, for example, if you go to TVNZ's website at the moment, there are huge ads for New Zealand documentary on Heartland, which is on Sky. So if you pay for it, you can see documentary on Wednesdays in prime time. But so I think that's the challenge that we have to address.
Want to add anything, Jay?
I think the challenge we also see is fine, because I think the future of film distribution perhaps might be a really golden one over the next 10 years, because we now have the ability as audiences to see and consume media in ways that we couldn't do before, and we also have the way to aggregate niche audiences and things like that. So there's this beautiful model unfolding. The problem is, how do we introduce documentary to audiences that perhaps wouldn't normally have watched it? And in the past, TV has done a great job of encouraging debate about a particular subject, because there's been a documentary about it, or there's been a way of reaching a large audience who wouldn't necessarily seek out documentaries, and I don't see how that's going to happen in the future with the new models of film distribution. So that, I think, is something that needs to be explored. How do we do that? Maybe there are other ways of doing that, online, offline, I don't know.
I mean, distribution is a really key issue, and I'm not very good at it. I admit, and I'm sure those two would agree that I'm not very good at it. I seem to be so sort of busy making the stuff, and to distribute it, people say self-distribution, you can all do it now, but it's still a lot of work. It's an uncertain outcome. So, I think those are really big issues about reaching audiences that we're all going to try and address. Thank God for the likes of Anna and James, I say. Yep.
And do you fully subsidise the work? Do you ever get any funding to take time off from your university job to dedicate to your films?
I did Punitive Damage because that was quite a big film. But usually I like to, because, it's a bit like double dipping, but I am on salary obviously at the university, so I manage to get all the money pretty much on the screen, which is why I can do more ambitious works that involve travel. I mean, Hey Tuki Puna, we had 3 trips to Afghanistan on a budget that usually would be spent in Auckland. It's partly that we're not taking fees above the line, so we can put a lot of money into the work itself. So at times when I have had to take time off, I do take leave without pay and then use money from the budgets to cover those costs. So, but I also do a heap of it. I edited Hey Toki for probably 3 months on my own for nothing. So I also do a lot of the technical work as well. And I don't want to, I think there's a big question about can you make a living as a filmmaker? I haven't actually tried, because I think I didn't come of age in that particular time in New York where sort of financial sustainability was not really the question or the desire. So I got kind of cemented in that kind of mindset. So I've never really tried to live off my work. I've tried to find other ways of supporting myself. Of course I'd love the work to make a lot of back end, but I don't try and take money out of budgets because the budget's pretty lean anyway. And if you are trying to do something ambitious, it's pretty difficult on the budgets that you get.
And you were saying that the university sees your documentary as your academic output.
They do
So-
now, which is great, because they didn't initially. So I picked up a life as a kind of academic as well. I have a PhD and I used to write regularly for journals and things like that. And actually made films secretly on the side. But all of a sudden, because so many students, I mean, it's difficult for a university because it's always tried to distinguish itself from a polytech, you know, the idea of craft versus academic. When I certainly think something like documentary, it's very research-based. And the university is a fabulous place to make documentaries because you've got all sorts of clever people, you've got a good library. You know, there's just so many potential documentaries just looking at what the staff are doing. So it's a good environment for documentary. Perhaps less so maybe for drama, I'm not so sure. But it's something the universities have to grapple with. But luckily for me, as I said, it was never my grand plan, but I've sort of lucked out because they do seem to, they definitely recognise my, I'm not sure about this last one. John Key called up Stuart McCutcheon and get that subversive out of your ranks.
Talking about funding and how you seek funding for your projects, especially ones that are more international and perhaps aren't as grounded within New Zealand content. Where do you look for funding that? I guess, yeah.
I've become a master at using New Zealand stories but shooting them elsewhere, and I think that's why the human rights trilogies of poor New Zealanders dying in sort of conflicts elsewhere both fulfilled the New Zealand content requirements of our funding agencies, but also let me sort of explore international situations I'm very interested in. But I have got a certain amount of funding from like the Sundance Documentary Fund and occasional co-productions with SBS or sometimes with Channel 4. But I think it's hard, and lots of people think, oh, like the New Zealand funders, I'm just going to go and get money from somewhere else. But my experience is if you don't have money from your home territory, it's very difficult to get money elsewhere because they think, well, why haven't they given them money? They don't understand actually how commercial broadcast environment in particular is. But what's been interesting for me is I could often take what was a full budget in New Zealand and say it was a pre-sale, and the funders didn't seem to mind that. So international funders would look at this, you know, amount of money I have from New Zealand, which is quite a substantial pre-sale. And once you've got that kind of leverage, they're generally more, they see more, put their own investment in more favourably. So I have to say I've been really lucky because I have been in production continuously, pretty much. I'm going to have a little break now, and then I get, I'll never get funded again. So, but it's tough. The fundraising parts are tough, I think. And you do have to be aware of market developments, what audiences are interested in. And students ask me whether you have ideas. And I sort of say, well, ideas are everywhere, but you have to have an idea that's timely, that funders would be interested in funding, that audiences would be interested in seeing. And sometimes the time is just not right. So they go in the bottom drawer for a while. But I think ideas, there's always many great ideas out there. I'm going to make a little joke, but I won't. Ideas. Yeah.
Annie, I have a question. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between the type, what you do with the story for the big screen and when you have to cut it down to the small screen? So if you're looking at a 90 or say an 85 minute or a 70 minute and you bring it down to 44 or 50, can you just talk a little bit about whether there's structural differences there, how you contain enough story in the shorter version to make a worthwhile piece and what you lose?
Yes, Christine's talking about the other thing I'm a master of, as well as finding those stories as reversioning, because you have to do a lot of reversioning. I don't think you can afford to be precious today. And the broadcast length in New Zealand is 44 minutes, which is pretty short. Most international broadcasters are sort of 54 to 56. And then feature, of course, is sort of 70, 80. So I often have 3 versions of my films, so it's just as well I know how to edit, actually. But that's a reality in sort of penetrating certain markets. But in this instance, the last film, Hey Toki Huna, I actually made it for Māori TV, so that was 52 minutes, and I actually extended it to 80 for the festival. Usually you go the other way, and that's kind of in a way easier, because you take a longer work. I think the storytelling does change. You can't, usually a broadcast cut is obviously much faster. You don't linger on the sorts of shots, like even that little montage sequence I showed you in Bamiyan Village was expanded out a great deal for the featured version. But also structurally, you can't do things like, you can't have structural returns, you know, like you have to be more linear, I find, with broadcast. Plus, because you're dealing with commercials, and I always refuse to, so many broadcast television documentary makers think in terms of 5 parts, because we have to have 4 commercial breaks. And I don't let myself do that. I try and think of it as a whole, and then I look at the least worrying places you can make a cut. And quite often they have to be turning points or something that's going to be, you know, entice people to come back, or that they'll remember after sort of ads have been blaring for 8 minutes. They'll remember what happened, hopefully. So there's a lot of differences, in fact, but both structural, so you can't really have those kinds of narrative returns in a broadcast version, because I just think people get too confused. You often need to do stronger setup at the beginning. You can't, you know, have things unfold as you can on the big screen.
So can I take from that that the 2 versions or 3 versions that we're doing are actually quite different?
I found with Brother Number 1, which was 100 minutes, I managed to retain a similar structure for the 56 minute, but I had to completely restructure it for the 54. So it's very much a thing of you try and it doesn't work, and you know, you trim first of all, but then it's confusing what characters can you lose. I mean, there's a problem if you just trim everything, because then it becomes just doesn't work at all. So often you have to kind of lose whole scenes. So, but it's kind of, I have to say, a case by case basis. But I love doing features, because you're able to say that, and Afghanistan is such a beautiful country. It's really lovely to work with those landscapes. I should introduce tourism once the war is over.
Do you start bringing people in as test screenings, or?
You know, I'm someone, I love this thing that I heard someone saying that they never finish films, but you just hit deadlines, basically. I mean, I could probably edit forever, but you just do have to deliver. So sometimes I do, and sometimes that's a requirement, and certainly for broadcast documentaries, you do need to get approval by the commissioning editor, so they need to come and have a look at it at some point. If I feel something's not really working, I certainly do have test screenings. I had a little one for Hey Toki Buna, just 2 or 3 people. And I think the key to test screening is not to listen to what people suggest, but rather the points that worry them. Because they'll say, oh, why don't you just get that person and do this, and then they'll make all sorts of sort of solutions that will be impossible and really confusing. But often they'll bring up the same problems. You know, if you listen to them carefully, you'll realise, you know, oh, that's not working for people. So I think the key to test screening is listen to the problems, not to the solutions. Yeah.
And I'm interested, obviously you've made lots of documentaries, and at the start of the process for you, you've got an idea, you've got a character, and how much you kind of know what the input's going to be when you start. And I guess added to that, at what point of the process, there's always a legal phase for you, and saying there's enough there to make something. At what point in the process do you go, feel, you know, there is something there, or you know, that kind of process?
I'm never confident I've got a film until it's done really, you know, and that's also the kind of issue with editing. I mean, it is a leap into the unknown. I mean, I've kind of been either I'm quite good at taking the temperature of the political moment, or I've been gratuitous, like Ruma bin Laden getting out of prison, or even East Timor, as I released Punitive Damage. In fact, there was a referendum that coincided with huge changes in Indonesia and East Timor, so I really felt I was, you know, surfing with history. And similarly with Hey Toki Buna, with John suing the military, and you know, and people starting, you know, lots of Kiwis being killed finally, made people start asking questions. So, I mean, in terms of, you know, we all have to write treatments and even scripts. But again, I do think that you then have to shred them to some degree and look at what you've got. Although I feel with more experience, it's surprising how similar sometimes my scripts are to the final works. Like with Brother Number One, I mean, I submitted an extensive script. And then finally, after ambushed editing for months and months and months, I had something very similar at the end. And I, was like, oh, I should do drama. I was thinking, they're a hell of a lot easier. So it's sort of, you never know, and there's always that uncertainty. Again, I say to my students, you have to let go of that script and look at what's in front of you, then to look at the footage you've got. Because sometimes that person who's incredibly charismatic totally dry up once you put the camera onto them, whereas someone else might be that you didn't anticipate, might have a wonderful story. So that's the exciting thing about documentary. You're constantly having to negotiate with kind of reality as it unfolds. Yeah.
Do you have any tips on how to make your interviewee open up, relax, or get to a state where they're going to give you good coverage?
It can be hard, can't it? It's mostly people who just turn and say, okay, it's all over now, and then they just suddenly relax and go,
Yeah.
and tell you all of these things. It's difficult. I mean, I think there has to be mutual trust. And for example, Helen in Punitive Damage, she's a very private person, even though she'd taken that lawsuit out. She's not someone who even I gave her some of my earlier work, thinking that would convince her, but she was living in this remote area of Malaysia and didn't have electricity, so I never looked at her work. But she trusted me for an interesting reason. She trusted me because I described Kamal as a political activist. I didn't see him as a sort of innocent caught in the crossfire. And that was important to her. And actually that very small fact brought her on side. So I think that you do need to develop trust. Another thing I say to my students is I think drama is a lot easier because you can fire an actor, unless they're great. But if you're working with a real person and they decide, like Georgina Via, for example, Georgie Girl was very much the life and times of Georgina. Had Georgina got put with me and sauntered off, I wouldn't have had a film. So, there's a lot of talk about how evil documentary makers are exploiting poor subjects, but it's very much a power relationship. I feel in a sense the subject can have much more power than the documentary maker. So that contributes to a lot of walking on eggshells, and I think that's a tremendous part of documentary making that's not articulated. So it's great you bring that up, because I think that personal connection is incredibly important. And none of us want to make what I would call hagiographies either. Sometimes you want to critique someone as well. So that makes it even more delicate at times. So it's not a job for the faint-hearted, that's for sure.
I guess on a similar vein, last year I did a student project based on the shooting of one of my police colleagues before I left the force. And I found dealing with people in authority extremely difficult as well, doing missions and things. How do you
Well, we had the head of the army, as you saw in, and it was strange. I was in Wellington yesterday, and I was going to meet a friend for lunch in Civic Square. There was this huge military display going on with lots of brass bands and marching and sons and fathers. And I heard Major General Dave Bourne is now at the podium, and he's in our film, of course. I put my glasses on and sort of scuttled by. I see these people in authority effectively as civil servants. They're paid for by the taxpayers. So I think it's their duty, actually, to front up to documentary makers and journalists. But it can be difficult. Dave is actually a nice guy. He's well chosen. He's not a buttoned-up monocle type of, army chief. He's very relaxed. He appears very Kiwi, etc. I know he has doubts about Afghanistan because Nicky Harder got some material leaked about him where he felt we should be in the Pacific. So, but he couldn't really say that on camera. But it is difficult, I think. But I come from a position where I think it's their duty, in fact. So I refuse to let myself get intimidated. With counter-terror, we were always turning up at military bases and prisons, and I was so amazed we survived those years. But I've always had that I guess, an anti-authoritarian stream.
Further questions?
I just wanted to, you mentioned earlier about what drew you to New York is the avant-garde scene there. And then when you came back to New Zealand, it felt quite conservative. What would you say about the scene there in New York now and also in New Zealand? I mean, I guess, yeah.
I mean, when I say New Zealand was conservative, there's always aspects of New Zealand that I've really liked, kind of openness and a competency and an interest in a relatively politicized, relatively educated populace for the whole. I think New Zealand has changed a lot from when I grew up. Dairies were closed on the weekends, or you could only get toilet paper and milk. It was just a very different. Banks used to close for months during the summer, so it's a very different environment. And I suppose one can argue, is it better or worse? What are the impacts of globalization or monetarism, etc.? I think New York's very different now too. It's certainly cleaned up a lot. It appears as a city, and it seems to me a lot of young New Zealanders are going to Berlin, seeking kind of what I was probably looking for in New York. So I think the kind of avant-garde centres of the world shift as well. I mean, New York's still a fabulous city, but as I say, I'm pleased to be working. New Zealand's been good to me. I've been working consistently. I've found audiences. So the other illusion is things will be easier elsewhere, which I don't think is true necessarily at all. I think New Zealand does offer up a lot of opportunities. Yeah.
Do you think there is like quite a prominent avant-garde art scene here that people?
Much more so. I mean, because I have worked mostly in the gallery system and art spaces and things, showing documentary or doing installation. And there was almost none of that when I came back in the early 90s, but now I see a lot of interesting work, which is good.
Well, on that note, we'll bring the session to a close. Once again, I would like to, on behalf of Script to Screen and J-Land Productions, thank all of you for coming to the whole weekend. Thank the University of Auckland for hosting us, and particularly thank Annie for that
Thank you for
session.
coming. I appreciate it.